What a great pleasure it is to welcome Dr. Angus Hay, Regional Executive for South Africa at Africa Data Centres, joining us on this episode of What's Next. And Dr. Hay is no stranger to the ICT sector. He's been around and seen this industry grow tremendously in the last few years, and especially over the last decade and 15 years. When you look back, Angus, and you look at this incredible growth that's happened with the explosion of fibre on the continent, I'm sure that you look back and you say we're making great progress.
Yeah, it's great to see you again, Aki. And yes, I think over the last decade and a half, we've seen massive growth in ICT. I think starting with the opening up of the telecoms industry within South Africa and then across other countries, but increasingly what we're seeing now is the opening up of cloud and of course data centers across the continent. And I think as South Africa, we remain the powerhouse that's driving the growth of ICT across the continent. We have some challenges, but I think certainly that's definitely the direction we see it going.
Well, at Africa Data Centres, you guys work with incredible amounts of data. I'd hate to think the numbers because there's lots of zeros involved there, and you look at global growth and the amount of zettabytes that we're creating on an annual basis, and you look at that exponential growth, it's astonishing. Based on this experience, could you please explain how fast the volumes of data collected by African businesses are increasing? Is that something that can be quantified?
As Africa Data Centers, we are the infrastructure that is housing a lot of the data that we see growing across the continent. So we see the global cloud providers, we are seeing financial services, we're seeing sort of cloud native businesses, lots of growth. It's quite hard to quantify exactly what that growth is. I mean, certainly we've seen analysis that says that we're seeing more than double-digit percentage growth in data volumes across the continent on an annual basis. But we're certainly seeing that translate into the infrastructure demand as well.
That's absolutely fascinating. And you can see this by the demand for data centers and what your customers are saying. They want more data, they want to use more infrastructure. Now, if Africa gets big data management and processing right, there are tremendous benefits. Economic benefits, I would imagine, is the biggest one amongst the other ones. But talk to us about those benefits that the continent will experience.
Yeah, I think let's just talk about what we're actually seeing in terms of the localization of data. As Africans, I think it's increasingly important that we store our data locally, and there are multiple reasons why that should be. So I think the first thing is that we've seen the arrival of the cloud in Africa. Up until a few years ago, the cloud was somewhere else. It was on a different continent or other continents. But we've now seen the deployment of hyperscale on the African continent. And South Africa today houses core hyperscale infrastructure, which is really, didn't exist more than 5 years ago on the continent. And we're seeing significant edge deployments across other regions as well. And that's really bringing the cloud closer to local businesses. So it reduces latency, improves performance. And of course, there's data sovereignty from many countries that is kind of bringing that data. So to translate that into what that means in terms of, access to data and being able to use data, what we see is and we track what our customers require. So it's fairly obvious in the cloud business what the demand is, but what we see increasingly with enterprises is that they're looking for ways to use the data they have. And because there's so much data being produced from every aspect of businesses, a lot of that data needs is not being leveraged. And the sort of things that businesses are starting to do is using that data to create new insights into their customers, their markets. I think it's also about new opportunities for businesses. So much of what we see nowadays in the broader cloud space is new business models.
Yes.
And new ways of leveraging that data. But I think there's a trend that we see, which I think is fundamental, which overrides all of this, and that is that for years we've been talking about big data, we've been talking about the leveraging the data that businesses have. But I think the thing that is really changing now is the rapid rise of AI. And I'm not talking there necessarily about the sort of public face of generative AI, the language models we see, the chat GPTs and the Bings and the Bards and so on. That's not really what we're talking about when we talk about leveraging business data for AI. It's all about much more specific use of business data with AI models. And what we are seeing is that the global cloud providers, the ones that typically make use of our infrastructure, are starting to offer multiple services. Just in the last little while, we've seen announcements from the big guys, the Googles, the Microsofts, Metas, etc., on some of the tools that are now available. And I think just to kind of put that in context, why does this matter? It matters because data centers no longer are places to store data. They're increasingly places where we need much more compute power. And we're seeing that compute power translating into more actual physical power. And of course, that compute needs to be closer to the customer. And if you think about a business that wants to leverage AI in its business, that's not so easy to do in your old computer basement, with a couple of servers. That requires cloud-style infrastructure and the reliability and power that you get from either public or private cloud infrastructure. So that's what we're seeing is really the ability to do that, and that opens up a whole lot of business models.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're quite right in what you're saying about the generative AI, and it's actually quite difficult to predict how much compute power we're going to be using in the next year, 2, 3 years, because exponentially it's just growing so fast, and that generative AI is changing on a daily basis. And these businesses, and every conference I'm sure that you attend, and I was just been at a recent one, a big one, and these guys are all talking about generative AI and built in and baked into their systems. So very much business case scenarios. You're 100% right, but the exponential growth of it must put a tremendous amount of strain. I mean, would that be one of the challenges that stand in the way of Africa taking advantage of the value that big data can provide? I imagine that energy must be there as well, Angus.
Yeah. So, just to step back again and look at it as a data center provider, we're very conscious of the physical challenges. So infrastructure is certainly the one of the biggest challenges across the African continent. But we're starting to see that change. If you think about it, you spoke earlier about fibre. We're part of the larger Cassava Tech group. Liquid Telecoms is one of the players there. Liquid has over 100,000 kilometers of fibre across the continent.
Wow.
We as Africa Data Centers, the data center infrastructure part of the group, are really rolling out the megawatts of physical infrastructure required to go with that. And we talk about data centers in megawatts because that's what actually drives the business. Megawatts translates into the actual compute power that is used within a data center. So we talk about nowadays in South Africa, we talk about 5 to 10 megawatt builds of data centers. We're starting to see similar sizes across other territories, like in our territories in Kenya and Nigeria. But I think that the availability of that infrastructure is fundamental. So that's certainly one of them. There are other challenges. I mean, there's certainly skills challenges across Africa. And I think, from our perspective, we put a lot of effort into ensuring that we localize and train skills. But as a data center provider, we also see the development of downstream industries from us. So certainly when we're talking to regulators, to governments, etc., we're often talking about the knock-on effect or the secondary effect of data centers coming into territories, and that is the data scientists, the analysts, the businesses that can start to use some of those capabilities locally. There are other challenges. There's data privacy. That's obviously one that affects everybody, not just customer privacy, in terms of the privacy legislation, but also just the general data protection regulations that we see, the sovereignty of data. These are all challenges, but I think what we're certainly seeing across Africa is that's not stopping the growth. Those challenges are things which we are facing, which certainly is we're seeing the exponential growth despite some of those challenges.
Yeah, and we seem to find solutions to many problems. I know data sovereignty was a massive issue, and it still is in across the continent. But we're finding ways around it, and we're finding solutions to these problems. But I want to ask you, how can high quality data center providers like yourselves at Africa Data Centers help African businesses solve these particular challenges?
Yeah. So I just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about, when you talk about data and what businesses are doing with their data, etc. You need to look at the nature of each business separately. So certainly what we find, and I mean, I think this is true of almost any business that operates within the wider sort of internet and online, is almost every business we come across is moving to the cloud. And yet, ironically, we find very few businesses that are 100% cloud. And the consequence of that is that migration to the cloud, obviously, deployment of cloud, the cloud guys are our direct customers, so we see the growth of the cloud. But what we find is that businesses that are moving into the cloud are often moving into a hybrid strategy where they need some private data, they need some private deployments, whether that be private cloud or private secure deployments. If you think about a bank, for example, banks
Mm.
have some part of their service which operates in the public space, but very often their core banking applications, etc., need to operate in private environments, often on dedicated equipment, and so on. And that is what drives the growth of and the need for the colocation data centers across the continent. So almost by definition, the migration to the cloud is driving the need for hybrid and therefore need for data center colocation. Very few businesses can operate with their own physical data center infrastructure that they built 10 years ago. It's
Mm.
they probably don't, that cost is not something they want to bear, and they can find a much more flexible model, a hybrid between using colocation, such as ourselves, and the cloud itself. And that model is increasing the case, and we've seen examples of that.
Yeah.
I don't know if a couple of years back, we as Africa Data Centers acquired the Standard Bank data center in Centurion. That data center today is a hub. It's a hub for financial services. It has multiple customers in it, co-located as a hub for financial services in South Africa and across the continent. And that has created a flexible, scalable environment for multiple players. There are various other things that are kind of obvious that you get from data centers, just the cost savings, the scalability. But I think
Yeah.
when we talk about the essence of what we see our customers requiring, it's reliability. So always on power. As Africa Data Centers, we provide 100% availability of power.
Wow.
That takes some heavy lifting in South Africa at the moment,
Yeah,
but
sure.
certainly that's right at the top of the requirements. And I think businesses that need to be always on look for that. Security, I mean, sometimes it's not that obvious when you're talking about security, but we follow a standard called PCI DSS. That's a payment card industry standard for data center security. And basically, if you want to run any kind of financial transaction, credit card transactions, etc., that kind of security is required. So, again, if you're not going to do that in your basement in your old data center, then you're looking for a provider that can give you that certification of world-class security. And then kind of obviously the last one is that by definition, the cloud equals the internet plus data centers. Combine those two is what really creates the cloud that we see today. And therefore, any data center needs to have maximum connectivity, multiple internet exchanges, carrier neutral, cloud on-ramps, and all the carriers and fiber connectivity. So I think those are the things which really make it practical and for businesses to look at colocation data centers such as ourselves as being the hubs of their businesses, rather than the historical way of looking at it as on premises. And as I said, almost no business is 100% public cloud.
Yeah. Gee, I'm trying to do the numbers of how you guys stay at 100% and how much diesel and energy you're consuming to keep it going. But that's what businesses want. You want that
Absolutely, yeah.
reliability. It's critical when you're running a business. You need to have that kind of reliability. How is Africa Data Centers collaborating with other role players in the business sector to really unlock the value that you've been talking about of big data in Africa?
Yeah. So there's a wider community. So certainly we're seeing the the African data center market, if you want to look at it as a whole, starting to mature. So we're becoming an industry. A few years back, it was hard to say, what is the data center industry in Africa. Today, it's very clear that there are a number of major providers, including ourselves. We are the only major colocation provider across the continent that provides hyperscale data center infrastructure that is African owned, in Africa, for Africa, by Africa. In any one of our markets we operate, we have 99% of the people running that business are from that local market. And we understand those markets. So we obviously collaborate, within the industry. We work very closely with interacting with governments and regulators and so on in terms of deployments. But certainly what we find is that it's all about understanding the business environments that we're in. I spoke a little bit about financial services. We have a similar financial services hub as we have in Samrand, in Centurion. We have a similar financial services hub in East Africa. Our East African hub is in Nairobi. That data center has been there for a better part of a decade, as part of the growth of the group. In South Africa, we have our 3 data centers, 2 in Johannesburg, 1 in Cape Town, and a new one that we're building in Cape Town. In Nigeria, we've just started, and we've deployed into a new data center in Lagos. But again, it's about local understanding of the businesses and their demand. And so we see different requirements in different markets. South Africa is very much dominated by the growth of cloud and the hyperscale providers, as well as increasingly now financial services. In East Africa, we've always been a very strong financial services and general enterprise business. And we're starting to see interesting things happening now in West Africa. In Lagos, we're starting to see the first of the deployments of hyperscale infrastructure as well, and certainly the wider businesses in those markets. So how do we make sure that we are driving the business? It's all about understanding those individual markets, and then taking our world-class capability, operating with multiple ISO standards, the capability with which we operate our tier 3 data centers, and replicating that across the continent in such a way that it's predictable, and gives that reliability and that security and that connectivity that those customers require.
And for me, the number that blows my mind is when you look at the continent, the population of the continent of 1.4 billion people, and less than 50% of those people have connectivity to the internet. And you look at the projections over the next 3 years, where you're going to get hundreds of millions of people that are going to be connected to the internet. I mean, it's mind-blowing to think what the possibilities are and what business that's going to generate, and how businesses need to be prepared for this kind of influx of people connecting to the internet for the first time.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, we draw these comparisons across the mobile space, we draw the comparisons across the fiber space. There's a very interesting comparison you can draw in the data center space. I mean, we're currently, the African continent is about 1% of the data centers in the world, and yet we are something like 15% of the population of the world. That disconnect is driving this growth. So what we've seen in the data center space is this combination of the cloud, localization of data, means that increasingly, Africa is essentially the highest growth area for data centers in the world, and that's what we're seeing, because there's this big disconnect between how big the markets are and how many data centers we actually have.
It's absolutely, the numbers are quite mind-boggling. And of course, we need to have this kind of collaboration that you've been speaking about. And if anybody's watching this and they're interested in working with Africa data centers to maximize the use of their business data, what should they do? How do they go about getting in touch with Africa data centers, saying, we've got this business, we've got a branch in East Africa. How do we do business together?
Yeah. So look, I mean, I'm going to give you the obvious, simple answer is go to our website and inquire. We have local sales and support teams within each of our markets. So anyone who makes contact with us, please come and see us. Well, interestingly, what we find as one of the most effective ways of getting customers to understand, what can we offer, is for them to come and see data centers. And we have 2 ways of doing that. If you want in one of our markets, contact us, get a hold of us. Please come and have a look at our data centers. I think customers are often blown away when they see the kind of capability in terms of how we operate those data centers. To achieve those high availabilities, it's not just about the kind of physical infrastructure. It's about how you operate. So I think please come and see us. And for customers who happen, who are not necessarily in one of the cities we operate, we've done some excellent work on producing virtual data center tours. So I would certainly refer them, please, customers to come and talk to us, potential customers to come and talk to us. We've done some sales to global customers entirely through virtual online environments like this. We can do a 3D walkabout in our data centers, show you what they do.
Oh, that sounds exciting. And I've been to one of your data centers, and yes, you're quite right. They are very impressive, and the growth has been very impressive. And thank you very much for sharing those insights with us, Angus. It's always good to chat to you and just tap into your knowledge of this particular business. And every time we have these conversations, there's been such progress that's been made going forward that it's so difficult to predict what the next 3 years are going to be like. But if we continue along this trajectory, it's going to be very exciting for businesses on this continent.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Aki. It's been great to speak with you again, and it's looking forward to great things, particularly in the data center space.
Dr. Angus Hay, Regional Executive for South Africa Data Centers. Get in touch with them and find out how they can unlock the value in your organization. Thanks for joining us.